thank you all for joining us. As I've mentioned in previous discussions, now that we are confined to Zoom, we have these discussions every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Um, and for those of you who are joining us live on this call, uh, but can't make it to every call, uh, all of them are posted on our YouTube channel, usually the day after. I just posted the link to our channel. You can click that and subscribe. And if you are watching this on YouTube, you can go to the description and there will be a link there to the London Ayn Rand Meetup where you can sign up to join these calls live. Now, today's topic is tyranny here? It was originally titled, "Is Tyranny Coming?" And then some measures were enacted that made me think, it might already be here. But I don't want to make light of a situation which is very complicated, and I'm not sure, what is the right approach to all this. Luckily, I'm just chairing, so I don't have to answer that question. But we do have two people who will attempt to answer. So joining us today are Nikos Sotirakopoulos, as always, Ayn Rand Center academic advisor and lecturer at York St. John, and Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online. So Nikos will go first. Now, after the two speakers give their opening remarks, we'll go to a Q&A. If anybody has a question or comment, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. You can do that at any point. It's not going to interrupt the flow of the conversation. We just won't call on you until it's your turn. So let's begin. Nikos.
Yeah, thanks, Razi. So, and thanks everyone for attending. So I'll be a bit cynical here, right? So I'll start from what was the situation before this crisis. So we were living under states and governments that could do things like throw you to jail for smoking weed, or in my country, in Greece, conscript you to the army despite your will. Or, they can tell you that you're not allowed to let your customers smoke in your pub. And recently they could send the police on your doorstep if you misgender someone on Twitter or something like that. And actually the latest discussion before the coronavirus crisis was that the government was actually discussing making misogyny a hate crime, although they could not objectively define neither misogyny nor hate crime. We've been living in under states that do all these things. And actually, specifically in a situation of crisis, for example, I remember in Greece during the crisis, there were all these special and supposedly out of the ordinary measures that would soon be revoked, as for example, that the government could appropriate 70 or 80% of your income. And guess what? They stayed also for a longer time after the crisis. So my cynical message here is that if you're surprised that in the first instance, a state that has such a power can prevent you from leaving your home without a permit, as it's happening, for example, now in Greece, where you literally have to text the government, I'll be going out now, and you get an automatic reply that says, okay. And so if you're surprised that it has reached that level, you've probably not been paying much attention on what was happening already earlier. But I have to say that this level of despotism has another level behind it, because the state is only one part of it. And the other part of it is how the media and how parts of the public sphere have actually been waiting for something like that. So usually what happens is you have a despotic government that brings tyranny, let's say, which is what is on the title, during the night, and you wake up in the morning and there are like tanks in the streets, like it happened in Greece in 1967. Now we have the very peculiar situation where parts of the people, and specifically, not so much the people, specifically the opinion makers, have been actually asking for this. And we see the peculiar thing, for example, that even people from the left, who used to say that this government is the worst thing that ever happened in this country, actually calling for the government to take these very, very harsh measures. So, and I think this is a sad result of various things that have been happening for some time now. And some various intellectual and philosophical tendencies. There was a very nice article in Spiked the other day by Frank Furedi, who talked about how this culture of fear that have been promoted by the elites and by the media for all these years, this is basically its fruition. This idea of seeing everything not through the prism of resilience and through the prism of, look, we have a problem, let's see how we can bring the solution. But seeing this situation from the prism that, oh my God, this is it, the worst case scenario is going to happen. So we have catastrophizing, again, on a grand scale, not specifically on this crisis, because you could say this crisis is something, something important, and this crisis is something difficult. But we're actually having this catastrophizing based on very prevalent in the culture, and now we see this actually being at a peak. And also, it's very interesting that we live in times when the term individual responsibility is now something as a curse word. So when you see people saying, for example, that when you see people saying, well, how about we lock, for example, those who are vulnerable, and the rest of us leave us decide whether we should go out. And then this is stigmatized as something bad. This is stigmatized as what? You want to have your individual responsibility? That's selfish. That's really bad. So to finish, we've had for decades both the right and the left calling for more control in more and more parts of our life, because basically they claimed that we're basket cases and we're potentially dangerous to ourselves, to others, to the planet, or I don't know what. And now what we have is a true and actually existing threat, like the virus. And you have also, of course, the necessary added elements of, quite often hyperbole or some fake news. But basically the threat is real. And what we get is what we've been, and when I say we, what many in the media, again, and the intellectual circles have been asking for a long time, which is more control in our lives, because we're not worthy of freedom and we're not all worthy of individual responsibility. So yeah, the situation is not that good, and the battle will have to fight when this fog clears. And actually, while these things are unfolding, will have to be quite difficult and will have to be quite crucial.
I don't really want to say that much. I really want to echo what Nikos has just said. I think there are a number of important factors to look at this. The first is that a lot of what we're living through at the moment in terms of the authoritarianism we've seen unleashed over the past week or so is built on pre-existing prejudices. This ideology did not come out of nowhere. These restrictions did not come out of nowhere. This is built on a long-standing view of humanity and the need for authority and the need for control. And the thing that really brings that home to me is this notion of the freedom to infect. So anyone who raises any questions about the lockdown or the shutdown or the creation of a police state virtually overnight, anyone who raises questions about those things is accused of wanting to have the freedom to infect other people. That's the accusation you will get from the left, and that's the accusation you'll get even from some people on the right as well. I think it's a really interesting phrase because it really sums up how those sections of society view freedom anyway, which is as an infectious thing, a toxic thing. And they've been saying this for a very long time, long before the existence of COVID-19. Free speech is often discussed as in terms of toxicity, toxic ideas, toxic points of view. They could corrupt people, they could harm people. The smoking ban was justified on the basis that we were all a threat to each other and we needed closer social control to prevent us from poisoning each other. Public gatherings have often been looked upon suspiciously, particularly football games where, thousands of people rub shoulders with each other and horrible chants spread through the crowd like a virus. So there's the pre-existing view of people as morally diseased and as freedom as an infectious thing, a dangerous thing, a toxic thing. So even the language that's been used around COVID-19 and the authoritarian response to it is not particularly new. This has been around for a long time. It's just been the catalyst of COVID-19 has allowed it to become much more pronounced and much more serious and much more dangerous. So I think the first thing, agreeing with Nikos, there's a pre-existing ideology which lends itself perfectly to the situation we currently find ourselves in. So this is not out of the blue. This is something that's been around for a while. And then the second thing is we really have to be careful not to look at this as simply government overreach or government authoritarianism. And in fact, the most striking thing in the UK, I think, has been the reluctance of the government to instill tyranny. And they've largely done so because they've buckled under pressure from the media class in particular, the left as well, and also we have to be very realistic about this. They have a lot of support for these measures from large sections of the public, which makes me quite uncomfortable, but that's the reality of it, and we can't ignore that fact. So the great irony of the current authoritarian moment we're living through is that it's being done reluctantly by the government at the behest of these mobs of supposed leftists and supposed progressives primarily, who are clamoring for more and more authoritarianism, and their response to the suggestion of a lockdown is that it had to be done instantly, it had to be very firm, and their only criticism of the government, the only criticism, was that they didn't go far enough. That's the only thing we've heard over the past week, that the lockdown it wasn't hard enough, didn't go far enough, wasn't firm enough. I think that really confirms that the left in the UK is now pretty much just a wing of the state. I mean, it's been a wing of the state for quite a long time, but now we know that it is the most extremist wing of the state. And you have this situation where the left has now been calling on a government that they previously referred to as fascistic to put everyone under house arrest and to empower the police to arrest people for doing too much shopping, and to empower the police to clamp down on fake news, which is the next thing that's going to happen. And fake news could cover everything from literally fake news to presumably people being overly critical of the government's policy, or people who might write something saying, break the lockdown, let's meet in the local park. All those kinds of things could very easily be collapsed under the name of fake news or dangerous news and could actually be censored. So we've entered a very dangerous moment. I think I agree with Nikos. It's been a long time coming, and I think it's incredibly worrying the speed and thoroughness with which the people of the United Kingdom have been decommissioned from public life is really quite chilling. I mean, the working class can no longer work. People cannot leave their homes. And our only role now is to wait for the daily government news briefing, like a sermon from the Mount, which will tell us how many people have died and what we need to do. And for me, one of the most chilling things that's happened over the past week was Dr. Jenny Harries, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, in yesterday's news briefing. She just decreed that the lockdown could last for 3 months and maybe 6 months. And my instant thought was, who are you to make this judgment? Who gives you the moral authority to make this judgment? Who voted for you? Who allowed you to do this? And what would happen if 1 million people disagreed with you, or 2 million people disagreed with you? And I think those questions are going to really start coming to the surface. I think they already are in Italy, where resentment is simmering, and there have been tensions because people haven't got enough food and people are sick of having their freedom crushed. There have been resentments simmering in China as well, where there's been some instability because people are sick of being locked up. And I think the same thing could happen here. So we're in a very peculiar moment. I'm not sure I would call it tyranny just because of the unusual balance of forces, but this is an incredibly authoritarian moment. Democracy in the United Kingdom has been suspended. Freedom has been suspended. And we are no longer citizens. We are now simply objects of a vast social experiment of the like which mankind has never seen before. And I think everyone has to take that incredibly seriously and recognize that even if this is a serious health crisis, and I believe it is a serious health crisis, that we do have to defend freedom, the freedom to speak, the freedom to move, the freedom to work, and we have to question the authority that unelected experts are currently wielding over every single aspect of our lives. And if we don't do that, then we will be in a very difficult position once this crisis is over.
Thank you, Brendan, and thanks, Nikos. So we have a question in the chat, and we don't have any hands raised, so we'll go to the chat question first. David asks, could a more charitable explanation of the clamoring for a harder lockdown be due to fear and the rapidly growing death toll? Let's start with Brendan.
I think there is a lot of fear. I think there's a sense of passivity has taken over certain sections of the public. But I think we do need some perspective in all of this. I think this is a very serious health crisis. I think it is a serious problem. It's obviously contributing to the deaths of, significant numbers of older people in particular and medically vulnerable people. But we do need some perspective on various different fronts. Firstly, we have to distinguish between people who are dying from coronavirus or dying with coronavirus. There's a real difference between those two things. A lot of the people who are dying are gravely ill people. They are people who are in the late stages of cancer or people who have severe respiratory problems. And it's a bit of a stretch to say that they're all being wiped out by coronavirus. These are people who were dying, in the process of dying. So to record all these deaths as having been caused by coronavirus is a stretch. I think the fear thing, though, is understandable because I think the media at the moment is behaving atrociously. I cannot remember the media being as bad as it is right now, particularly the TV news, which I've completely and utterly stopped watching. I would hugely encourage everyone else to stop watching it too. I think it is just a relentless wall of dread that's being pushed at people hour after hour with all these horrific stories from Italy and Spain with no context whatsoever, no analysis whatsoever, no discussion about the slowing of the number of deaths or the question of how many people actually have the illness, which would mean if it is a lot of people, which some experts think it is, that the death rate is not as high as we think. None of that is visible in this constant berating of the public with these horror stories. So I understand that there's fearfulness, but I think a bit of perspective and a bit of respect for the fundamental necessity of freedom would help to alleviate some of that.
Yeah, I totally agree on the media. And the thing that made me stop watching the news, so remember that last week at some point, Trump goes and does one of the press conferences and talks about this chloroquine, which hopefully could be a solution. Now, obviously, whenever Trump talks, there's a good chance whatever he says is not corroborated. But the interesting thing is that here was the first optimist message. And then you'd see both people on Twitter and the journalist going mad. It's as if they thrive on this fear. It's as if they say, oh, here's a good news. This goes against the narrative. So yes, of course, fear is, and I'm not playing the tough guy, right? I'm locked at home. But this is something different. The fact that some of us feel that individually the best thing we have to do, mostly because we haven't got much to do outside, is to stay at home, has nothing to take out of the validity of the points that Brennan is making about taking freedoms away.
Yeah, so we have a few questions, live questions, and then we'll go to the chat. So, Elliot.
Hi, guys. So quickly, I had a question for Brendan and then a bit of a statement for you both to sort of comment on. So Brendan, I read the other day in Spiked that, well, I read it in Spiked, but it was, in The Guardian as well, that the supposed first girl to die of the coronavirus without any pre-existing conditions, in fact, did not die from the coronavirus, actually had a heart attack, and she allegedly had a cough, so they said, oh, she had the coronavirus, blame that on that. That article that was originally reported in The Guardian was then taken down from there. I was wondering if you knew whether or not that information was still corroborated? And if it was, do you not see the irony of the mainstream media calling for the censorship of fake news when they are some of the biggest proponents of it?
Yeah, I think the case of Chloe Middleton is very interesting. So she's a 21-year-old and she died. We think she died of a heart attack. That's the latest information that is available. But it was widely reported that she died from coronavirus, and it was held up as proof by pretty much everyone in the media and also everyone on social media that young people can die from this even if they have no underlying health conditions, which is just not true. I mean, there might be, who knows, we'll find out in a few months or maybe a few years. There might be some outlying cases where that's happened, but it's so rare as to be unworthy of headline news or front page news. So but in this case, according to the Guardian report, which as you say has now been removed, she died of a heart attack, and the doctors who treated her were very shocked to hear that people were saying she died from coronavirus because she didn't test positive for it. So it looks like a very good example of fake news. People I know are trying to find out why the Guardian removed the article. I don't know if the Guardian has found more information. So I'm trying to find out a bit more. I know some people are trying to find out a bit more, but at the moment it looks like there was a rush to say this was a coronavirus death when it wasn't, and that's what it looks like at the moment, which would speak to the whole climate of hysteria that has descended on this issue.
We need spiked these days, like the fact that it's the most read article. It's like we need this kind of people with guts and saying the unsayable. So yeah, thanks for doing that, Brendan. Yeah.
We'll take one more question from one more live question, and then we'll go to the chat. So George.
I would like to ask both speakers what they think the root causes for governments, politicians on either sides, and also the media to be pushing this agenda of more authoritarianism. I have some ideas. One of my ideas is that there is a lot of public support for what's going on right now under the premise that it's actually a positive thing. We hear that a lot. We hear people saying it's the first time that as a society we are paying attention to nurses and to certain people that have been ignored in the past, and we're putting humans above profits. I heard that quite a lot. So I see some people taking a philosophical stance to it and being quite happy with the turn of the society as a result of this authoritarianism. I think though that's a marginal kind of group. Most of it comes from a side which I'm quite sympathetic to. If you're an old man or a person with vulnerability, an old woman, and you pay taxes all your life, and then suddenly, you catch a disease which could have been prevented. You go to a hospital and there's not enough ventilators. And there isn't enough ventilators to keep everyone alive, or at least to try to keep some people out of those that could have been saved alive. And then, you say, okay, I thought we had a contract, I thought we had a deal. I've been paying all this money so that when the time comes, you guys save me. Now, you didn't give me a chance to put that money in a bank account or to save myself via an insurance, so private insurance, so then when this happens, I can take care of myself. You took it forcefully. So now, don't I have a right to expect of you, government, to take all the necessary steps, including to take the necessary steps for flattening the curve, as they call it, so that when I do get into the place where I actually need a ventilator, there are enough ventilators for me for you to deliver your side of the contract towards me. So I'm quite sympathetic to this, and I wanted to hear your views on what other root causes, or even if these are, in your opinion, the main root causes for this support towards authoritarianism.
Right. I'll go first because what George said brought to my mind. Actually, this whole crisis is bringing to my mind quite often the discussion around climate change, because we have two similarities. The similarities that in both cases we have governments supposedly acting on a scientific consensus where there is no scientific consensus, and in both cases acting not so much towards like efficacy and solutions, but more towards dealing basically with the crisis. So some days ago, we saw on BBC an article saying why building a ventilator is not like nuclear science. So why is this delayed? And one of the manufacturers said because it's a regulatory nightmare. And I haven't heard back from that. Like I wish to hear more about this kind of stuff. Like why doesn't the government allow this build of these ventilators very, very, very quickly? So this would be a practical step, and the same is with climate change. I don't hear much about, for example, nuclear energy. I don't hear much about worst case scenario, for example, geoengineering. And not only I'm not hearing much, people are actually horrified with this prospect. So it looks like we want to find ourselves dealing with the crisis rather than overcoming the crisis. Now, what you said about the fact that you expect to go there and find a ventilator, yes, that's true, and that's why we take this seriously. But it's not that with these measures we make sure that everyone finds a ventilator. Today, I've heard from people who had other kind of exams, medical exams, that might have shown something worrying, with something completely different that even needs completely different machines. And then they were said, all tests are canceled for a month. So it's not that these measures are actually bringing the optimal results in terms of people being able to go to the hospital and having their health taken care of. I mean, it's one big issue is what we're discussing, which is like how all this undermines freedom. The other big issue is how this handling of the crisis doesn't seem to be doing that much for people who are actually have needs in terms of, I don't know, tests or ventilators or all that stuff. So I would be willing to give, to cut some slack saying, yeah, at least this works, but I'm not really convinced that this is the case.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's correct that lots of people are saying, this is a question of putting lives before profits. And I think there is a sense of, especially among the left, they're trying to create a sense of collectivity around that idea. I think it's a completely phony idea. And the way that they are talking about the economy is completely false. So you can't juxtapose lives to the economy as if the economy is just some kind of machine. The economy is people's lives. The economy is work. The economy is production. The economy is consumption. The economy is the means through which people earn a living and stay well and are productive citizens of society. So this idea that we're protecting lives and the economy doesn't matter is completely and utterly surreal. Because if you destroy the economy, which I think we are at risk of doing, you will destroy people's lives. You will destroy their sense of agency, their sense of purpose, their right to work. You will lower their life expectancy. You will give rise to mental health problems, physical health problems. So Dr. John Lee, who's been writing some good things in The Spectator about this crisis, he says this is not lives versus the economy. This is lives versus lives. And that's a grown-up society would be able to recognize that. So I think the left in particular, who are pushing this idea that we're protecting lives and we don't give a damn about the economy, they think they sound very progressive and radical. But all they're doing is showing how completely cut off they are from ordinary people who work in the economy and make their living through it. It's all very well for academics and people in the knowledge economy who don't produce anything to make statements like this. It's fine for them to stay at home because they're not productive people. They can carry on making their podcasts. They can carry on having Zoom discussions like this. That's fine. And society will grind to a halt anyway, because I think a lot of people, particularly millennial people, are going to find out that they're actually not that important to the economy and everyday society. That's going to be a real wake-up call. And the people who are important are construction workers and school teachers and bin men and dairy farmers and people who make things and make sure that society works. And the removal of those people from society is going to have a massive impact. So there's a class element to this. And Madeline Grant, a writer for The Telegraph, she touched on this very well, where she said, you know, all these millennial cheerleaders of the lockdown who are saying everyone should, she said there's a Marie Antoinette feeling to this, because when they say, let them work at home, they sound like Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. There's just a complete distance from real life. So it's not lives versus the economy, it's lives versus lives. And I think, I completely agree. Absolutely everyone in society has the absolute right to expect complete good healthcare and a goddamn ventilator when they are incredibly ill. Everyone has the right to expect that. And our societies have lots of questions to answer as to why that might not be the case in some instances. That's completely true, I think. But I also think that the unintended consequences of the lockdown could prove to be quite severe. As Nikos says, there are tests and operations being cancelled. I'm sure there are huge numbers of people not going to the doctor at the moment because they feel they are a burden, and the government constantly says to them, protect the NHS. That's the new slogan, which basically means protect the NHS from people. I'm sure lots of people aren't going to the doctor even though they feel ill. There are lots of incredibly old people now who cannot leave their homes, and that will be very detrimental to their health, possibly fatally. So the unintended consequences of how we're managing this health crisis will create a new health crisis. And that's the kind of grown-up discussion I think we need to have about what's going on.
Just a very quick point. We Greeks know what a financial crisis means. So before 2010, we see the cheesy slogan by the anti-globalization left was people over profits. But in Greece, actually the crisis was not that, we didn't have a complete shutdown of the economy indefinitely, which seems to be the case now. So whoever wants to see what a relatively small financial crisis can do to a country, you know, go ask your Greek friend who is abroad, or the Greek family that had to sell houses, not to mention, as Brennan said, you know, possible medical implications, because there's no direct link. You know, I can't prove that. But anecdotal evidence shows that even in your health and even in your mental health, a very bad economy can have very, very, very bad effects.
All right, let's go to a question in the chat. I think this is in relation to Brendan's comments on the media, but if I'm wrong, Pas, you can raise your hand and then I'll unmute you. So the question is, the pendulum has been swinging in this direction for 20 plus years. Don't you think this is the apex and it will start to swing back? Brendan.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. I think it depends on what we do in response to the crisis. One thing that's really getting on my nerves at the moment is those people, again, usually people on the left, who are saying that this crisis, COVID-19, will have a transformative impact on society. I think it will, but the idea that it will have some kind of progressive, future-orientated, positive impact on society is a complete fantasy. It's not. Diseases don't make history, people make history. And the example I use is that, you know, when the Black Death swept through England in 1348 and killed possibly 40% of the population, that didn't transform English society for the better. The thing that transformed English society for the better was the Peasants' Revolt a few decades later, which was a response to the stringent economic measures that were introduced by the authorities after the Black Death. And it was the actions of those people which led to the end of serfdom in particular and created a brand new society. So I find this, the way in which, you know, some people are almost cheerleading coronavirus. They're almost egging it on because they think if it sweeps through society, it's like when people were excited to hear that Boris Johnson got coronavirus, it really spoke to how they are investing this disease with a sense of momentum, almost as a kind of left-wing force. The idea that this disease is a kind of progressive force that is sweeping through the government and forcing it to adopt a kind of Corbynite agenda and possibly will leave society better in the long run. It's such a deluded, deranged fantasy, and it's so spectacularly anti-democratic and anti-humanist. So the idea that the pendulum will swing to the other way naturally, I think that's quite questionable. I think what might happen, and I hope this happens, is that lots of people will start to ask questions. I think they will hopefully will ask questions about the rationing of healthcare and the organisation of healthcare and whether it is actually as efficient as we thought it was. I hope they will ask questions about the role of the media. I think the media has been so spectacularly exposed by this whole crisis, and I think if I had my way, it would not recover from this. I think we need a serious reckoning with with the incredibly destructive role that the media plays in contemporary society. And I think people will ask questions about the left and the so-called progressives and the level of their contempt for ordinary people, which has now reached such an extent that they were literally whooping and cheering when 66 million people were put under house arrest by the government. So what I hope, I don't think the pendulum swings naturally. It depends on what we do, and it depends on the questions we ask. And I think that's one thing worth thinking about now. All the questions we want to ask during this process, because I don't think we should put our brains on lockdown even during a lockdown, but also the questions we want to ask after this crisis about how society is organized and how it can be improved.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to make one point in retrospect, so it's also why this is happening is basically because we have lost the battle of ideas in the previous decade. So when I think myself like a month or 2 months ago, I thought, yeah, you know, all this fighting for ideas is important, but it's also kind of, you know, hobby or whatever. Actually, it's an issue of life and death, literally. So that's why I said when this is offered and while this is taking place, we need to see ourselves not as these weird people who have too much free time in our hands. That's why we advocate for these ideas about freedom, individual agency, all that stuff. It's because that next crisis, whether it's a war or this kind of stuff, based on whether these ideas win, it could either be an issue of life or death for us or our beloved ones, or it's an issue of flourishing for the whole of society. So yeah, after this, let's take ideas even more seriously.
I know the healthcare issue, at least in terms of, in principle, what should government's role be, is a point where Nikos and Brendan probably disagree, but I think we'll leave much of that to a future debate, hopefully a live one, on the role of government. But Kevin asks in the chat, has anyone noted that the healthcare system is basically nationalized globally, and that the healthcare workers basically have an unquestioned authority because of their specialized knowledge? These basically indoctrinated socialists in general have established a committee dictatorship. Nikos.
Right. Yeah. You know, I don't agree necessarily with the indoctrinated socialist part, but again, I will draw the parallel with climate change. I'm very uncomfortable when people say science says this. So science could very well be telling you, for example, that climate change is happening and it's real. But what you do about it has very little to do with what, quote, science says. So in this situation, for example, the science can give you the models, but then the science cannot tell you why you lose so much time with the tests. So for example, I think one of the big discussions that we should have at some point after this is the role of the FDA in the United States and the role of these bureaucracies in delaying the tests, or their megalomania of wanting to have one test. So yeah, I think this raises bigger questions about what should be the role of science. The role of science is to give us the information that we need, but then how we act based on this information, and whether it should be one universal act is a different issue. Because the other thing is, now it seems to be like there's only one model on how to deal with it. And even worse in Greece. So for example, while Boris Johnson was not caving to the pressures, in Greece he was dealt as basically this cartoon personality that the Brits they've elected this funny guy, and now he's leading them to herd immunity. And the fact that they have no idea what they're talking about, when Johnson got the coronavirus, they said, aha, you see, herd immunity didn't work, which of course has nothing to do with, I'm not even convinced that that's what Johnson wanted to do, the herd immunity. But there's this idea that now there's one model, and if you dare to deviate from this model, you're basically an enemy of humanity because you're anti-science, which means you want people to die, which is a ridiculous narrative.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think, expertise has a very important role to play in society. We need experts, we need medical experts, technological experts, constitutional experts. It's very good that these people give us their expertise and their advice. That's very good. But after that, or as part of that, we also need judgment. We need political judgment and democratic judgment. And that is not something that can be done by people who, by virologists, for example. I don't trust the virologists to tell me what's best for Britain and its population. They can give me a graph telling me how the disease is likely to progress, and even that is always open to question because experts disagree. But they are not the best people to decide that we should lock everyone down for 3 months. That has to be a public democratic judgment. So the tyranny of expertise is really coming into play in relation to this, because we are now living, we no longer live in a democracy in the UK, to be perfectly blunt about it. Parliament has gone AWOL for a month, which I think is a completely disgraceful decision. Our Parliament has decommissioned itself. Most of the cabinet are ill, so they can't meet, at least not physically. And the people who are making the judgments that determine whether we stay under house arrest or not are people we never elected and who most of us don't know about. So we now live in a biotechnocracy. We live in a technocracy run by biomedical experts. And that's not a kind of country I signed up for as a British citizen. So there's a real problem with that. And I think we're starting to see how expertise can play a problematic role if it is allowed free reign over free-thinking citizens. So we need to get that balance back in order. But I agree with Nikos. If you say anything like that, you're instantly written off as someone who wants old people to die and is anti-human, because these experts have decided that there's only one model, which is not true. Sweden and the Netherlands are both pursuing a different model. We won't know which was the right model for years. We won't know for a very long time. We won't know in 3 months or 6 months. We won't know for at least 2 or 3 years what was the best model in terms of extra deaths. So, but the fact that Sweden and the Netherlands, which are both very rational countries with fairly good and fairly well-developed political systems, the fact that they are doing something different to us suggests that that is at least something worth considering. So I'm very interested in how their program goes and whether it proves to be more successful than ours. But I think the broader point is, I don't think that National Health Service is made up of indoctrinated socialists, and I don't even think it's a socialist entity. I think it's something slightly different to that. But what I do find quite creepy at the moment is this kind of public worship of the NHS and this kind of Soviet-style applauding we had the other night, which, I was going to write an article on it, but I didn't, because I knew that it would be like, you'd get flack for days and weeks on end. But it did creep me out. I do think there's a limit to how much longer people will put up with this. You can't lock people in their homes and deny them the right to work and drag them on the street once every couple of weeks to applaud a state health service. That's not a good way to run a country, and I think people's patience will run out eventually.
Well, Nikos, we'll get back to you in a second, but Kevin has his hand up, so I'm guessing you have a follow-up, Kevin?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me? Just to
Yep.
confirm. Okay, yeah. So both Nikos and Brendan, you both disagree with the concept they're basically indoctrinated socialists in the healthcare system, and that's around the world. So since you both disagree with that, and that's kind of what I'm asserting, I want to challenge that disagreement. I mean, Nikos, you mentioned how scientific knowledge and the technocracy is becoming a having a greater authoritarian influence on our cultures. And you use the example of climate change. Well, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Climate Science Journal, and I have a book coming out at the end of next month. And it's called basically, if the Earth warms 1 degree Celsius, let it cool for 30 minutes. And so I know the response to scientific challenges of the prevailing paradigm. So when I say basically indoctrinated socialists in the healthcare system, I look at their responses to challenges to their paradigm. When I say, what is their paradigm? The paradigm is that it takes a year and a half to get a new vaccine or to approve a drug. And so so being a techno guy, I have degrees in mechanical and aerospace engineering and computer science. And I've written a book on the scientific method. Basically a new epistemological paradigm with a new theory of validation, new theory of deduction, new theory of induction, et cetera. And I validate all this work in an AI software that can reason from natural language. So I'm operating from a little bit of a different paradigm. So with an improved scientific method, I go in and I look at this climate change thing and I say, boy, there's a lot of things that are not adding up. So anyway, so back to the point, I feel like the antipathy toward challenges to these technocratic paradigms is politically driven. That's why I make that assertion that they're basically socialists. Right. And I think the paradigm is politically driven, and when you start to see it that way, and you add up the evidence in support of it by watching people's reactions to challenges to their paradigm, you start to see that it appears to be an ulterior motive. So I'll let you guys.
Right, yeah. So there might be this political motive. My disagreement is I don't think it's super productive if we call it basically socialist. And I've been disagreeing, for example, forever with Razi on whether we should call Corbyn, for example, a Marxist and a communist, because it's just that I think, terms and words matter, and I think if we describe them this way, we're not describing them well. And also it could be misleading, because then the right wing is going to say, oh, if it's not the socialists, then it's us, and we're gonna solve the problem. Actually, I see also conservatives having this megalomaniac and this kind of technocratic urge to power. And you see it, okay, now it's a different topic, but you see it specifically also in the culture wars, where you see the right and the left basically mirroring each other. That's why, I agree, I probably agree with your premise. I just don't think it's productive to call them socialists, because also if you see it historically, socialism as a historical movement is basically dead. And what we have is something completely different, maybe very bad, but it's not socialist. And B, because, as I said, I don't think there is this other side which has these different premises, at least on the political level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I think the main enemy right now is technocracy and managerialism, and the oversight of society in a way that is post-political, actually, and post-ideological, and that's what lends itself to the suggestion that you can't criticize it because it's the natural way of doing things. It's not even a political choice. It's not an ideological choice. It's just the natural way of organizing society. So it's something actually worse. I agree that there is this kind of, anyone who criticizes the NHS or anyone who criticizes the way in which health is organized or the way in which this crisis is currently being handled will be rounded upon and demonized and shouted down and called an enemy of humanity, as Nikos said. But I think that's not driven necessarily by a political ferocity or a political ideology. It's driven by almost a sense of weakness and desperation, and a recognition perhaps at some level that there is a fragility to this way in which society is organized, and therefore you cannot allow any form of criticism. So there's a knee-jerk element to it. So, but the problem I see with society at the moment is that it is shifting in this direction of a kind of post-political managerialism, which is a real shame, because I think the great thing about Brexit in 2016 is that it was such a huge democratic blow against managerialism, against technocracy, against the domination of a kind of supposedly post-political elite who knew what's best for the rest of us. It was an attempt to recover a sense of democratic agency, a sense of political purpose, a sense of people being engaged in how society is run, the question of how society is run. My concern right now is that, you know, Brexit was one step forward and this crisis is 2 steps back, because I think it is heightening the prejudices of that section of society, the kind of expert classes, and their conviction that they know what's best for us. And, you know, that I see lots of articles at the moment, particularly in the liberal media, about the return of the experts, the revenge of the experts. You know, the experts have, one article in the Observer said the experts have returned from the priest holes in which we cast them, and they are going to come and save us from our own stupidity, essentially. So we're witnessing a shift. I would say that Brexit was an attempt to re-politicize public life, to re-moralize public life, and to raise those kind of pressing questions once again. I think possibly through this process, that will be wounded quite severely, and we will go back to a situation of a kind of post-political expert class who govern every single minutiae of our lives. And I think that's the thing we need to guard against very, very carefully.
So we have a queue of quite a few questions in the chat, but Paul has his hand up, so he will ask a live question, and then we will go back to the chat. Paul.
Okay, thank you, Razzie. I wanted to come back slightly a bit on what Brendan says. At present, I feel it's a bit early to be talking about anger. I mean, I was working up until last Tuesday, and then after Tuesday, we were ordered to work from home, and I've been working from home since. I've been going out every day walking, including today, and people are still out going for a walk. People are going to the shop and everything. But if you think that this has been going on for a while in Italy, and you're only just beginning to see people in Italy showing some anger now, people are burning things like EU flags online in Italy because the way the EU has treated Italy over the last few weeks, and that's beginning to bubble up. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, to remember the 3-day week. I remember the power cuts and everything else. And there's a certain novelty at first, and there's an extent to which people are willing to put up with this. It's almost like an enforced holiday, and a lot of us have only just been forced out of work and to home in the last few weeks. The biggest thing that's likely to happen in the short term is a boredom and a frustration. You never know what's around the corner. You never know what might happen. But it feels quite early to be using the term anger. The only other anger I've seen is, for instance, at the police drone incident in Derbyshire. So I've had expressions from people of specific anger about specific things, but not about the general situation.
I actually agree with that. I think this is one of the things that really worries me, to be honest, and I'm still trying to get a handle on why this is happening. But I think there's a huge amount of public acceptance of what's going on at the moment. I'm trying not to be too cynical about that, and I understand where it might come from. I think it comes from a sense of, you know, people are quite fearful of this virus. They're worried about their friends. They're worried about their elderly relatives. They are willing to make certain sacrifices for what they consider to be a broader goal of social solidarity and protecting vulnerable people. So I think there are lots of good intentions behind the fairly broad acceptance of what's happened over the past week. But at the same time, it concerns me because I think it does speak to a desire to be told what to do. And that's something that worries me a great deal. I mean, I always knew that was there among the left. I always knew that was there in the media class. And it didn't surprise me at all that you had all these media idiots at the press conferences every single day saying, shut down, shut down, shut down, because they don't trust the public. They don't trust us, and the left doesn't trust us. And so it didn't surprise me at all that that was their instinctive cry: shut everything down, keep people at home, look after them. But the fact that lots of ordinary members of the public went along with it too is more concerning. I think I don't think there is anger at the moment. I think it's possible anger won't come, but the phrase I've been using is I think there could be a simmering resentment, and I think that could grow because even with the government's massive bailout and the huge budget that it announced that would essentially pay some people's wages, even with that, people there are going to be shortages. If we're not producing things, then you can't buy things. If we're not producing food, then you can't buy food. There are lots of things that are going to start to fall apart relatively soon. And I think people could start feeling hungry, angry, concerned, desperate to go out and visit their mother who they haven't seen for 3 months. All these things are going to start happening quite quickly, I think, maybe 3 weeks or so. The idea of a lockdown for 6 months strikes me as so utterly perverse and unsustainable. I'm amazed that politicians are even proposing such an atrocity. So I would be very surprised if the lockdown lasted more than 4 or 5 weeks before people started to ask some serious questions or simply started to break the rules. But I do think we have to wait a bit before we start to see that kind of response.
Yeah, and the other thing, Paul, is that every week we have more information, so the death toll question is raised more and more, because the more areas we have, the more countries we have with a lot of testing, the narrative that talks about, I don't know, 8 or 6% is more and more questioned, which, I mean, it's simple maths. And so it's impossible for this to last 6 months. It just can't happen. You could say the European Central Bank is going to print money, but that can't go on forever. I mean, there has never been in the history of humanity, correct if I'm wrong, a period where the state has shut all production. I mean, even in Soviet Union, in the war's 5-year plans, you had factories working in full. Even in wars, you have people doing productive stuff and creating things. It's the first time, as far as I can tell in history, where the government tells you, you are not allowed to produce. And I mean, I don't even want to think what's going to happen if this goes not for 6 months, but for 2 months. And also, let's be aware that when this is over, whatever the result, if the result is we've overplayed it, the government will say, we've saved you for more deaths. And then it's going to say, we're going to also save you in terms of now it's time, for example. I mean, I can already see the happiness experts, for example, in a year saying, oh, now we'll have to live with less. So I can already see this bullshit kind of slowly materializing in front of us. That we have to be very vigilant with and call out this.
Actually, that's something one of the Extinction Rebellion people was arguing on talk radio today, saying, kind of hoping that people will learn to live with less. There will be, some kind of upside for the Greens, that people will learn to fly less, people will learn to be more local, to do without a bit more. So they're hoping for that uptick for themselves.
I'm telling you what, Paul, when this is over, I'm taking a train like every other weekend. We watch together games at Leeds. Yeah.
I think in relation to Extinction Rebellion and that stuff, I mean, that's exactly what they're saying. They are saying that this is, the upside of COVID-19 is that we will realize that it is possible to cut down our carbon society. And Yanis Varoufakis said the exact same thing. He said that if there's one good thing, it shows that it is possible to live in a shrunken society without producing so much carbon. These people are insane because, the vast majority of people are looking at what's happening now and thinking this is deeply, deeply undesirable. So the more they say this is what a green society would be like, and I think that this is what a green society would be like, far fewer airplanes flying around, far less production, infrastructure projects being put on hold, people being decommissioned so they can't work in supposedly polluting industries, all that kind of stuff. This is exactly what a green society would be like, and it is absolutely horrendous. It is horrendous and illiberal and destructive and unhappy. So I welcome all these Greens who are saying this proves we can live like this for longer, because that could prove to be one of the flashpoints where people say, but we don't want to live like this. We might be prepared to do it for a short period of time, but that's all. So a lot of political ideologies are going to come out of this looking pretty bad. One is the green ideology. I think one is the woke ideology. I think a lot of the left ideology, the pro-state ideology, a lot of that's going to come out of this looking pretty bad, pretty exhausted, very, very, very compromised. But again, I would just say that's not a natural process. That really does depend on people asking the right questions and putting the right pressure on these people and exposing them for the intellectual, moral frauds that they are. So I think Extinction Rebellion is at the front of that queue, because if this is the society they want, then it only proves what a deranged cult they are.
I agree.
Yeah, I remember attending a panel discussion at last year's Battle of Ideas where Brendan spoke on the topic of Extinction Rebellion, and there was one of the Green speakers, one of the environmentalists, said something to the effect of, "We need to reduce the human population by a third." So yeah, I'm sure he's one of the people now rooting for the virus. Okay, we will take a couple more questions from the chat, and then we'll go back to live questions. So Alejandro asks, do you have any comments on the recent developments in Hungary? Apparently the president Orban is now able to rule by decree without care for the legislative power.
So I haven't got special knowledge on Hungary. What I do know is that we always like to portray Hungary as this kind of bad boy of Europe, very possibly for the right reason. I'm not saying. But for example, why don't I hear more about Greece? It's because we have this liberal, kind of woke, good-looking, Europhile prime minister, which, I mean, I remember in the days of the army, to go out of the barracks, I had to get a written permission, which says you go out for 2 hours and you come back. And now I have to do this, Greeks have to do the same thing. So yeah, it looks like what's happening in Hungary is just the next step. But I wouldn't be that surprised if this is not something specific, like specific to the bad nature of Orban, but it's something that we could see in other countries. And actually I've seen progressives arguing for tougher measures. So again, I don't know much. I've seen something on Twitter. I wouldn't be surprised if this is the case. Obviously, you know, Orban is not my go-to guy, and he shouldn't be anyone who is a progressive person go-to guy. But I'm not convinced that this is something which is going to be very specific in Hungary and having to do with Orban's megalomania or authoritarianism.
Maybe I should give a little bit of context. So I'll just read from, this is from CNN. So it says, the suspension of parliament, punishments for journalists if the government believes their coronavirus reporting is not accurate, and heavier penalties for violating quarantine regulations are all made possible by the order. No elections or referendums can be held while it is in place. And it is indefinite. It doesn't have a...
Yeah, that's obviously unacceptable and horrible and horrendous, but it's not miles away. I mean, I've seen this country calls for censorship. I mean, I've seen on Twitter people calling for banning fake news. I mean, we've seen the enlightened leaders of the European Union calling for a clampdown on fake news before the coronavirus crisis. So, sorry, but I cannot be that surprised. I mean, it's horrible, but I cannot be that surprised.
Yeah, it's the double standards in relation to Hungary are just so shocking. I think it's almost racist. I mean, every single time Hungary does something like this, British progressives in particular, and also other so-called progressives, go completely nuts, even though they called for the exact same thing in the UK. I mean, literally the exact same thing. In the UK right now, Parliament is suspended. Elections are being postponed. There is a new government department that is devoted to tackling fake news, as they have in Hungary too. And political protest is banned. Trade union activity is banned. If you look at the coronavirus bill, which Parliament passed before it then decommissioned itself and went off, it's extraordinary. It's the most shocking attack on liberties in this country in history. There has never been, in peacetime, there has never been anything like this. Just to give you an example, you can be sectioned on the say-so of one doctor indefinitely if you're considered to be a threat to public safety. You can be forced by the police to return home and not to leave your home. political gatherings are completely and utterly banned. All public gatherings are banned, and no allowance has been made for political gatherings. So you cannot have a political protest against the coronavirus bill. You cannot have a political protest against the lockdown. So if this did go on for 6 months and we decided to go to Parliament and have a protest, we would be breaking the law and we would be instantly criminalised. So all these progressives saying, oh my God, Orban has imposed dictatorship on Hungary, they have asked for the exact same thing in the UK and they've got it. So they are staggering hypocrites. And there's an anti-Eastern chauvinism to some of this. You know, when we do it, it's evidence-led and it's right and it's good and it's proper. When he does it, it's evil and nasty because, you know, those Eastern Europeans are really dodgy people. So there's a real double standard here. The only difference is that Orban's punishments for these crimes are more severe than ours, but he's only created the same crimes that we've created. So I just think the double standards are actually quite grotesque, and I think we should focus, Hungarian people should challenge the Hungarian government's restrictions, and we should focus on challenging our government's restrictions. And I don't like the way in which people bash Hungary to make themselves feel better about the fact that they are actually disgusting authoritarians as well.
So Rich asks in the chat, how much power do the civil servants, such as those with Public Health England, wield over the politicians? They seem to be the ones calling the shots, with the politicians almost doing as they are told. Brendan.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really worries me at the moment. They do seem to wield a lot of power and a lot of influence. And I think it's right that the government should listen to experts at this moment, because we have this novel new virus which is causing a fair amount of harm. But as I was saying earlier, alongside expertise, you need political judgment, you need public judgment, you need to decide what is necessary for society as a whole. And I think if our elected politicians cede too much authority to experts, then they undermine themselves and they undermine democracy. And we end up in a situation where Public Health England and chief medical officers and chief scientific officers wield too much authority over society, to such an extent, as I was saying, that Dr. Jenny Harries, the deputy chief medical officer, could announce yesterday that the lockdown might last for 3 months. Who is she to say that? I never voted for her. She's never stood in an election in her life. This is a serious issue. This is, I'm not being facetious. The question of from where she gets her authority is a very important question. And if she thinks that's what we should do, she needs to convince us in an open, frank, honest way, and we need to have some capacity to question that. At the moment, I think what's happening is that the political class is buckling under pressure from the deranged media and from the expert cliques, who I think are quite important in this process. What's missing is any sense of political authority, any sense of political judgment, and any sense of political engagement. So I'm deeply concerned about the rise of a biomedical technocracy.
Yeah, and I think the politicians today and the experts are made for each other, and here's why. We live in times when politicians, is almost impossible to come up with a specific political identity. So again, just remember, 1 month before this, we had the Tories, supposedly, quote, neoliberals, telling you that 15 years from now, you're not allowed to buy a new car, which is a non-electric car. So how do you have this political mess having some authority over people? The easy solution is, well, I am the political wing of science. And again, we see this with climate change. I would say even wokeness is a bit like that. It kind of gives them this moral authority that they otherwise completely lack. So yeah, it's very worrying, but it's not a coincidence. It's been here and it will be here, as long as we haven't got like proper political battle with proper ideas rather than empty cells like the ones we have at the moment.
So Eamon's going to ask a live question, then we'll go back to the chat. If you do have another question, or if anybody has a question, please raise your hand. I'm not sure we'll try to get through all the questions that are currently in the chat, but I'm not sure we'll get to any more. Eamon.
So thanks to the two speakers for doing this. One of the few things that is keeping me sane is, writers like some of the writers from Spiked and Spectator, who are voicing, concerns about the lockdown and resisting calls to, curb freedom, and also the alternative sort of interpretations of, people like showing you the science, like Dr. John Lee, for example. And also governments like Sweden, which are taking a slightly different approach. As Brendan said, it will take a long time before we actually figure out what was the actual right approach. My thoughts about the whole situation have evolved into, now I sympathize with the government. I think the government is melting down. They have no idea what they're doing. They're not prepared. But it wasn't exactly, I would say most of it wasn't their fault, because this is something that you would need to have prepared for years in advance. So countries like South Korea and Singapore were prepared because they had a disaster with a previous previous epidemic in I think SARS and MERS in South Korea's case, and were shocked into preparing for the next. So a silver lining of this, I would say, is that even if it ends up being that this pandemic wasn't as serious as everyone is saying, and I think it's not as serious as people are saying, at least we will be, hopefully would demand that the governments prepare for a more serious pandemic in the future. And I'm hopeful, because I'm hopeful that all these draconian measures will be dialed back, because I see, as a healthy amount of resistance in some parts of the media, and from speaking to people are not very happy about this situation. And I think that I don't fear that this is the chance of the statists to take over and carry out a police state from now on. So I'm quite hopeful that there will be a backlash to the unpreparedness of the government, and that we will actually learn from this.
Right. So, yeah, and one of the reasons I had some objections with the title when we're discussing with Raz, I don't think we're going to live in tyranny, from now on indefinitely. But I'm not so optimistic in terms of government getting the right lessons. Did they get the right lessons from the crisis of 2008, for example? I mean, I might disagree with various people on what happened in the crisis and what should be the right thing, but I think we can all agree that I don't see any serious lessons being taken for that. I don't think the Greek government learned much from how it dealt with the crisis. I don't think it took much lessons on its relationship with the EU. So, yeah, obviously we're not going to be locked down for that long, I agree. And it's very difficult. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in Johnson's shoes, no question about that. And it's the most difficult time to be a politician who has to take serious decisions. But I'm not that optimistic that they're gonna get. So do you think, for example, that from now on, this religion of the NHS is going to be challenged? Because I see it going to the opposite direction. It will be, now if you dare to say anything about the NHS, now you should shut up forever, because it's the NHS that saved us. And if it didn't save us, it means we need more of the same. So I'm not that optimistic in terms of whether we're going to get the right lessons. It's up to us, and us doing a good job. I mean, not only up to us, but we have to do a good job on that. But I'm not necessarily that optimistic.
I think, I kind of flip between optimism and pessimism. I think I think there will be repercussions from this that will last for a very, very long time. And I think one of those repercussions will be the recognition by people in positions of authority of how easy it was to do this. And that's the thing that worries me most. I would like it to have been more difficult. I understand why it wasn't more difficult. People are worried, people are concerned, and people don't want to be called enemies of humanity. There are all those understandable reasons. But the speed and the relative ease with which millions of people were essentially placed under house arrest is a lesson that I think we will have to work quite hard to dismantle. That's the thing that I'm thinking of going ahead, because it's very possible. It's very, very possible that the lockdown ends in a month or 2 months or 3 months, and people go back to relative normality, and a second wave of the virus comes, but we don't respond in the same way as we did the first time, because we recognize society will collapse. And it's possible by the end of the year, we will forget that this happened. That's all entirely possible. But the lessons that will be taken by people who unfortunately have an enormous amount of influence over politics, society, and culture will be that fear works, and people are atomized, and it's relatively easy to control us. So that's why I think it's so essential to have a pushback. Now, that pushback might take the form of 6 weeks into the lockdown we start saying, now we're not doing this anymore. Or it might take the form of, after the lockdown we start to say, this can never happen again, and this coronavirus bill has got to be taken out of the statute books right now. And next time there's a pandemic, you have got to be prepared, and you cannot lock us down. But whatever form it takes, whether it takes the form of rebelling against the lockdown at some point in the future, or asking serious questions about the lockdown once it's over, that has got to happen, because the danger otherwise is that the takeaway from this will be that even in a developed democracy like the United Kingdom, it's easy to control the populace, and it's easy to take away every single one of their democratic rights, which is what's happened to us now. We have no members of parliament representing us. We do not have the right to protest, and it's possible there will be certain things we're not allowed to say on the internet. So all of our democratic rights have been pretty swiftly taken away, and we have to create a situation where that at least becomes an incredibly controversial thing. Otherwise, I think the more pro-state element of the establishment will see it as a victory, and that would be a bit of a disaster.
Noy asks in the chat, how would you like to see the state deal with this situation? What should be the restrictions on the population, if any? Brendan.
Well, as everyone keeps telling me, I'm not an expert. I get that all the time. But I think, in my view, the preferable response would have been a surgical strike. So David Katz, who works at the Yale Griffin Prevention Center in the US, he wrote, he's a very serious person who understands disease far better than I do. He wrote a very good piece for the New York Times about why a surgical strike would have been far preferable to this kind of blanket approach, which will create so much collateral damage. And by a surgical strike, he meant possibly isolating the most vulnerable people, possibly encouraging self-isolation among older people, and encouraging is the key word there, because I think people need to have the choice to isolate or not to isolate, and allowing the rest of society, where we know that the impact of the disease is, usually quite minor, allowing those people to get on with working and creating and producing and living. So I think my preferred option would have been a more surgical strike. We should have devoted a huge amount of resources to treating those who fall ill. We should have taken measures that would have, through choice, protected vulnerable people from falling ill, and allowed the rest of society to go on as much as possible. I think that would have been better than shutting everything down, because that will harm everyone in society over the long run, which seems to me to be such a self-destructive thing to have done.
This plus relaxing a bit the bureaucracy with the tests. I would rather take my chances with a test that would come from a highly esteemed medical company, and the test being even 85% correct, and me taking the responsibility for this, rather than this thing that now I have to rely on some bureaucrats to release the test whenever. So because without tests, we're completely blind. That's why I don't even bother seeing the numbers. The only role that the numbers play now is to scare us. I'm not saying there's like a big conspiracy, but the numbers mean nothing if you cannot compare numbers of dead people with the numbers of people who have this, not with the people who actually go to the hospital. So yeah.
Well, the question about the BBC is not really relevant, but I'll ask it, and maybe you guys can give a one-word answer. Read the media, should the BBC be scrapped?
Yesterday.
The license fee should be scrapped, yes.
Okay, well, we can have an entire debate about that at some point in the future. George asks, was the stimulus offered by the government a good decision? Will it help economically? Do the businesses and individuals that are being coercively shut down by the government have a right to expect to be supported by the taxpayer?
Very quick answer. If by stimulus we mean the money that so if the government tells me you're not allowed to go to work, yes, I have a right to get money from the government. The stimulus in terms of the quantitative easing and the stimulus back to businesses and all that stuff that we see, I don't think they will work. Let me refer to people to that event, Razi, last week with Jonathan Honing. The video is on the YouTube channel. But the money that the government gives you because it prevents you from going to work, yes, I think this can be legitimate. The fact that it is taxpayers' money, unfortunately, all government money is taxpayers' money. But for this one, I would do an exception because it would be the equivalent if the government would put me to prison and then tell me, oh, sorry, it was a mistake. Then the fact that the government would give me a compensation, I think would be legit in the system that we're living.
Yeah, I think it's right that the government is funding those people who it is preventing from working. I think that's just actually essential. And if you're going to prevent people from working, you need to pay them so they can survive these next few weeks or months. But I just think the whole thing was probably unnecessary. I think so many people could have been allowed to carry on working, and I think the whole thing is a mistake. Nikos is right. All government money is taxpayers' money, and we're going to be paying for this for a very, very long time. And I think a lot of people haven't factored that in. You know, this is going to be a debt hanging over us for a long time, and by us I mean ordinary people. So there's going to be, you know, the great irony is that so many leftists have been going on for the past few months about how Tory austerity killed 120,000 people, which, by the way, is a highly questionable figure. But austerity definitely does impact on people's lives. And now they are actively campaigning for a recession of the like we haven't seen for a very long time, with no regard whatsoever for people's right to work or for people's right to a good life. So it's incredibly destructive. One thing that's come up, which I'm completely opposed to, is the idea of a universal basic income. And that's been a central part of this whole discussion. So lots of people on the left and in the media have used this crisis as an excuse to say, we need a universal basic income. That's the solution to this crisis and future crises. I'm completely against that because I think they have no appreciation of how much people value agency and autonomy and the right to govern their own lives and to earn their own living. And I would be really opposed to any government measure which co-opted more and more people into the welfarist structure, because I think that's an incredibly dispiriting, I think it's destructive of both individual initiative, but also of community solidarity. Because the more that you are tied into an intimate, needy relationship with the welfarist state, the less likely you are to show individual initiative and the less likely you are to turn to your neighbors or your community or your friends when you fall into a bit of trouble. So I think the contemporary left doesn't understand how destructive welfarism can be if it becomes a permanent measure rather than just an emergency measure when people are struggling in a very real way.
One quick comment, Razi. Exactly what Brendan said. So what saved Greece from the crisis, the economic crisis, was exactly this strong community and family and social networks, informal networks, like the underground economy, the fact that you could help the people you love and you could trade with them even under the radar. Now we can't even do this. If I have to help someone, the best thing I can do is leave a supermarket bag outside of their door. So, yeah.
Ella has a live question. We are going to prioritize people who haven't asked a question yet. So, Ella, you are unmuted.
Hi. Thank you, the two speakers, for offering many ideas. And so far, the main ideas that I get from the discussion is how should we be concerned on the way the authoritative measure being applied, and as a consequence, maybe the implication on our freedom of speech. So on freedom, I also have a question regarding to Brendan's comment on whether the government have the right to impose the duration of the lockdown and what should people do during this period. Because as I understand, I agree that freedom is a necessary condition to progress. But I think in some situation, there's a need for productivity in order to prosper or in order to save life. And do you think that in this emergency, and suppose that COVID-19 is an emergency because it is a hyper-infectious disease and we don't know much about the cost in the long run, do you think that holding an election or waiting for the free market to adjust would be too unproductive? And a more general question for two speakers is, based on what reasons or evidence should we be confident in our society ability to navigate ourselves through any deadly emergency? And in what situation do you think we should forfeit our freedom?
Well, we should always be incredibly reluctant to forfeit our freedom for any reason. Particularly, you know, we have to be honest about what's happening right now, which is that we are being asked to forfeit every single aspect of our freedom on the basis of scientific models, not even on the basis of scientific evidence, because the evidence is still incredibly patchy. We still don't really know what's happened in China or what's happened in Italy. These things can't be measured for quite a long time. So we've been asked to sacrifice an awful lot on the basis of evidence that is still quite thin and will take a long time to fatten out. So that's what makes me incredibly skeptical. I know a lot of people are now saying things like, you know, stop whining about your freedom. This is a crisis and people are dying. I think that's completely the wrong. I'm not saying Ella is saying that, by the way, but some people are. I think that's completely the wrong approach, because it's those of us who are whining about our freedom who will help to protect society in the long run. And that means that when we come out of this, we can have a serious challenge to the coronavirus bill, a serious challenge to the lockdown measures more broadly, and a serious discussion about recovering freedom and democracy, and so that it becomes even more vigorous and healthy after the crisis. So whining about freedom is actually the most important thing we can do right now. Even if we conform to the lockdown, which most people are doing, even if some of us accept that the lockdown might be necessary, and I think the jury's out on that, I'm incredibly skeptical. Other people will think it is necessary. That's fine. Even as we do all these things, we absolutely have to keep talking about freedom. We absolutely have to feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable with what's going on and with how many freedoms have been taken away from us. Otherwise, we're in serious trouble. So it's not like I'm saying everyone should go to the pub, everyone should go to their local pub and smash the doors open and have a pint, right? Because you're not allowed to do that, and it would be counterproductive and it would be antisocial, because it would not fit in with what society is doing at the moment. It might come to that in 6 or 8 weeks' time, who knows? But at the moment, I don't think that would be a very sensible thing to do. What I do think is sensible is to constantly question the need for this lockdown, constantly question the imposition of this historically unprecedented bill, the coronavirus bill, and constantly question the way in which Parliament has disappeared without a trace, so that we have no political representation in this discussion whatsoever. We have to keep questioning that in order to keep alive the spirit of freedom for when this crisis starts to work itself out.
Yeah, very quickly to answer your question, when is it okay? I would say when you specifically are a danger to someone. So if I have definitely the virus, I think there's a good case I should be quarantined from going out or from infecting other people. I mean, generally, I'm talking generally about the lethal virus. On the issue of the free market, the reason I support it is not any ideology. It's because for me, free market is free people. And let me give you one simple example. In Greece, there were many companies that switched immediately when there was not enough antiseptics in producing antiseptics. And it took the government 3 weeks. So it give them a special permit, because otherwise they weren't allowed to switch from making, let's say, whatever cleaning to antiseptic. So that's why I want people's ingenuity these days to be on its maximum productivity. That's why I'm very cautious, and I don't want the government to interfere in the free market, because there is no free market. It's people being free to produce and come up with good ideas on how to solve problems and pursue the good.
David asks in the chat, what do you think about the over 500,000 volunteers? Are they heroes, Nikos?
Volunteers for what? I mean, I don't know, because someone who volunteers for a good cause is a hero. Yes, I would agree with that. But it's unclear to me, volunteer towards what cause? Go and help in the hospitals, for example. Even people who are sick are not allowed anywhere near the hospitals. So I'm lacking context there on the question of the volunteer. So I'm not sure what it refers to. I mean, I have all the goodwill, and I like cheering heroes. Last week we had an event on heroism, but yeah, I would need to know more about that.
I don't necessarily think they're heroes. I have volunteered in my local community, and I've done some shopping for people. I don't think of myself as a hero at all. I think it's just a bare necessity in a society that has collapsed overnight, and it's an incredibly unfortunate situation that some people find themselves in because of government decisions and so on. In relation to the 700,000 people who signed up as NHS volunteers, I think there's a hugely positive instinct behind that, and I do think people want to assist in the delivery of food and the delivery of medicine and so on. I'm worried about the way in which they have all been collapsed into the state structure. I'm not convinced at all that the best will be got out of these volunteers, because we live under a very sclerotic state. And the idea that our civil service will do a good job of enthusing those volunteers or getting them to do productive things, I think is highly questionable. I think a lot of them probably won't do much at all, not because they don't want to, but because the state will find it difficult to find them jobs to do. And of course, at the same time, you need a really deep criminal records check to do lots of things in terms of volunteering, and the state is very strict about who can volunteer and who can't, and that's been, red tape has been a real barrier to volunteering over the past few years in terms of criminal background checks on everyone who wants to run a local football team or deliver food to old people. So I think that will come into play as well, which is probably why lots of local people have set up their own WhatsApp groups for their street, or in my case, for our block of flats. And some of that has proved quite fruitful around the country, and people are doing what they can. I don't think it's heroic. I just think it's an unfortunate necessity at a time when, quite perversely in my view, society has been ground to a halt.
We'll take two more questions from the chat. So John says, I've had little success with friends and colleagues in discussing the question of individual rights in the current context. There seems to be an acceptance that the government and media are right. How can we get people to seriously engage with ideas of personal liberty, the alternative being a search for scapegoats and inevitably greater collectivism? Nikos.
Okay, the $1 million question. I think the best way is to just present the facts. The best way to advocate freedom is in reality itself. See what we can do when we are free. See what productive people and clever people can do when they are free. And see what happens when you have 2 or 3 center planners who are not even sure about their own models, having to impose their view on all of us. See, for example, how important it is for me, as Brennan says, to be able even to volunteer and to put my name and my number on the door and the WhatsApp groups, as opposed to this having to be organized from some random bureaucrat that has never seen me in his life. So the best argument for freedom is just see what happens when people are free and what happens where people are not free. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where people are not free, and that's why we see bad things. And even worse things will follow, as Brennan said, when people are not allowed to work, because these production lines are not going to be automatically be able to operate on their own forever. And it's not that this is a separate part of society. Or people, when people talk about the heroes, they never talk about, for example, who is funding all that stuff. So it's okay to say, well, who cares about the 1%? Let them, let them perish. Yeah, who is then going to fund the restaurant guy? Who is going to fund all that stuff that keeps things being open? So when we are free, we achieve great things and we live in the best time in human history. When we're not free, we live in the 99.9% of human history, which was basically darkness and gloom and not good times.
Yeah, I think I've always questioned the idea that there is this kind of innate conflict between individual liberty and collective ideals. I don't think these things are in conflict, and in fact I think they're incredibly complementary, and that's one of the key points John Stuart Mill makes on liberty, which is obviously one of the best things written about liberty. He makes the point that the more free the individual is, the more healthy society is, because free thinking, free-willed individuals are more likely to be, as he says, virtuous, by which he means socially engaged, concerned about others, and so on. So I've always disliked the idea that there is a contradiction between individual liberty on the one hand and social solidarity or collective impulses on the other hand. They actually tap into each other very well. So one of the points I would make about this current crisis is that a society in which individuals are constantly told that they are untrustworthy, cannot have freedom of speech, cannot be relied upon even to raise their own children without constant government advice, have to be stopped from smoking, stopped from drinking, have to be controlled, every minutiae of their lives has to be controlled, which is the kind of state we lived under for the past 20 years. Those individuals are not likely to be hugely confident, socially engaged people. That's the problem. So one of the reasons I'm quite impressed by the outpouring of voluntary spirit over the past week or so is because I'm concerned that a society which crushes individual initiative and individual spirit, as our society tends to do, is also a society that will fray social bonds and social networks. I think we have to get back to the kind of Mill viewpoint, which is that the greater individual liberty there is, the more likely there is to be a strong sense of social responsibility. And looking at how those two things are intertwined, I think is actually quite important, especially in this crisis and going ahead from this crisis.
Yeah, and the same applies with radical politics. Like, it's quite funny that people who are fantasizing about barricades, they consider us that we are so vulnerable that we cannot even see a poster with an unrealistic body image. But supposedly we're going to bring a revolution.
So we have a few hands up and a few questions, but we only have time for one more. So the last question is from Tom. When this is all done, will there be a reckoning with China?
Oh, the China question. I'm a bit torn on this question because I've always been opposed to China bashing. I think there's anti-Chinese sentiment amongst some people in the West, which is unhelpful. And I think it exists on the right and the left. I think it often takes the form of attacking China for its so-called pollution and its speedy economic growth and its destructive lurch forward into capitalism. And I think those criticisms are completely wrong. I think it's absolutely fine that China is going through a difficult, dirty, smog-ridden industrial revolution. Every nation that reaches maturity has to go through an industrial revolution at some point, in my view. So I've never liked those criticisms of China, and a lot of those criticisms are coming into play now. This idea that China is a uniquely dirty country, a toxic country, is going to infect the rest of us with its bad habits, makes me uncomfortable. At the same time, I'm also uncomfortable with the idea that it is somehow inherently racist to criticize China. And we're hearing that a lot from the left at the moment. Anyone who says, China should have told the truth about this virus at the beginning, and then we could have taken more precautions, which I think is a perfectly legitimate criticism. Anyone who says that is shot down as being racist and evil and anti-Chinese. So I'm really torn on this because on the one hand, I think the instinct to blame someone or something for the arrival of a novel new virus is not a helpful instinct. And in fact, we're publishing a piece on Spike tomorrow on the blame game in relation to coronavirus and why the blame game is never very useful. And I think the blaming of China is not useful. At the same time, I think the censorious attacks on anyone who wants to talk about the Chinese regime and the censorious destructive role it plays in its own citizens' lives and the impact that that can sometimes have on global affairs, I think it's wrong to censor those people and to accuse them of being racist. So for me, it's a pretty difficult question. I think we absolutely should question the Chinese regime and the role they play. At the same time, I think blaming China for this in a knee-jerk, prejudiced way is probably unhelpful to a conducive debate about global affairs.
Yeah, China is this empty canvas on which we project whatever we want. So the left say, for example, China is rampant capitalism. The right says China is communism, which is just factually wrong. It's not the case. And I think the biggest victim of China is Chinese people, unfortunately. But on the coronavirus debate, we don't know enough. I can't tell you. As Brennan said, it will be years maybe until we know exactly what happened, what are the responsibilities. So whatever I would tell you now would be not informed, so I cannot answer it.
So this is, I think it's been 2 weeks since we moved everything to, or less than 2 weeks since we moved everything to Zoom. We had two great speakers here tonight. So I want to thank you both. In terms of content, the content was absolutely fantastic. And if anybody who is here live wants to see this again, this will be on our YouTube channel, as will every Zoom meetup we have. And the link to the YouTube channel, the link to the YouTube channel is in the chat. So thanks again to everybody who was here, and thanks to Nikos and Brendan, and see you all on Wednesday.